right, well, welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar, ESSER Funds, Today, Tomorrow, and the Long-Term Impact on Learning. I want to offer you all a warm welcome and share my appreciation for all your work and preparation to get this new school year off to a good start for your students and your families. We know it's been a long slog over the past 18 or so months, but we're all optimistic for a really great school year ahead of us. Today's webinar is brought to you by NetRef, a classroom management and learning analytics tool that helps educators keep students focused on learning and gain insights into the effectiveness of their EdTech investments. All right, so I think we are ready to get started, and I will switch gears and welcome our presenters to join me on screen. All right, great to see you all, and I'll just do a quick introduction and then we'll get going. We are pleased to have Carl Hooker with us, who is an author, in fact, working on a new book right now, speaker, educator, and former school technology director. Always nice to have you, Carl. And Carl, again, is joining us from Texas.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
Yeah. Carl is joined by Doug Meskar. Doug is an education consultant who has worked as an education policymaker, entrepreneur, and executive in the private sector. He started his career as a classroom teacher and went on to serve at the U.S. Department of Education as Deputy Chief of Staff for the department and Assistant Deputy Secretary of the Office of Innovation and Improvement. He also served in the U.S. Congress as a professional staff member for the House Education and Workforce Committee. Welcome, Doug. Good to see you.
Hello.
And we also have Harrison Parker with us, who is Vice President of Operations for NetRef. Welcome, Harrison.
Hey, everybody.
All right. So I think, Doug, you are going to get us started, so we will let you take it away.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Emily. I appreciate the chance to speak with you all. I'm going to take us through an overview of the stimulus funding, some of the timelines, uses of funds, and some important details that we need to keep in mind as we look at these dollars. You know, we focus a lot on sort of the immediate needs, the short-term opportunities and emergency needs that we've had to fill. But we also want to take a longer view on these dollars and understand the opportunities we have for investments that will take place over time and potentially be transformational. So let me dive in, just share some facts. Many of you probably know this already, but it's always helpful to baseline. As you all know, there's been 3 stimulus bills from the federal government dating back to March of 2020, December of 2020, and then March of 2021 with the American Rescue Plan. They've grown over time, which you probably already know. You can see there both the totals for education and then specifically the amounts for the ESSER fund, which we're going to dive into in some level of detail. So lots of dollars. They're generally similar in many of their requirements, but there are some differences that we want to get into. So let's keep moving forward. This is probably the biggest, issue, both in the differences as well as, some of the challenge that we need to talk through in terms of short-term, medium, and long-term opportunities. So when we look at when the bill was passed, and then when we look at when the funds need to be obligated, and so by obligation, that means there needs to be an agreement, a contract in place that effectively encumbers those dollars. And then liquidation. So liquidation, you'll see, it actually has 120 days after obligation deadline. So when you look at, for example, the American Rescue Plan at the bottom row there, it was enacted, March of this year. The obligation deadline is September 30th of 2024, meaning you have to have a plan in place. And then you actually have until January of 2025 to fully liquidate those funds. Now, obviously, you can liquidate before then if you need to, but that's the absolute deadline by which you need to liquidate. So each of these has sort of a staggered timeline. The CARES Act, that obligation date is coming up September 30th of 2022. And then obviously the 120 days to fully liquidate those dollars. The CRRSA, a year out from that, 2023. And then the American Rescue Plan. So you can kind of see this stair-step, staggered deadlines that each of these funds have associated with them. So let's keep moving, though, and talk about the American Rescue Plan. There was the ESSER Fund, the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. The third iteration, the U.S. Department of Education just calls it the ARPesser Fund. I think most other people call it ESSER 3. So whatever you call it, and you can see here I combined them both. The priorities for all three ESSER funds around clearly health and safety, learning loss. Now, I use the term learning loss here. I know not everyone is using that term. I know some people don't even like that term. Accelerated learning, recovering lost instructional time. I use that word because the American Rescue Plan uses that phrase. So just to use the phrase that was actually in the legislation, I'm going to use learning loss for this presentation, just so you know. So social and emotional well-being of students, we all know this was a huge priority before the pandemic, and even greater needs post-pandemic as students come back in, and just the trauma of not only being out of school, but then coming back in and what that's like. Educational equity, huge priority for all of these funds. Again, something that was before the pandemic, even more so with these dollars. And then that last bullet point, that lasting impact on the educational system. And I know some may be wondering, how do we do that with those deadlines that you just showed? Well, I've got some thoughts and some ideas that we'll get into and we'll discuss around this, but that's actually a really important question about making these funds have a lasting impact, a greater impact than just meeting the current needs of here and now. So I'm going to keep moving forward here to our next slide. So when we talk about the ARPesser Fund, or ESSER 3, there was $123 billion for SEAs, state education agencies, LEAs, local educational agencies. Now, out of that $123 billion, $800 million was designated for homeless education. So what was distributed by formula, which I'll share in a minute, was about $122 billion. Now, in addition to that, so over and above that amount, there was $3 billion specifically designated for the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Now, those were one-time dollars. They didn't raise the baseline of IDEA, but that's an additional $3 billion, I think in part because Congress recognized that our special ed students, our students with special needs, were impacted maybe more than any other group of students, and have already had deficits, already had challenges in the normal course of things, but in remote learning and hybrid learning, those challenges were really magnified in many respects. So $3 billion extra for IDEA in the ARPesser dollars. So again, moving forward, so these dollars, you may know this already because this hasn't changed from ESSER 1 all the way through to ESSER 3. It's based on a state and a district's Title I proportionate share. So for example, Carl, in Texas, if Texas as a state gets, let's call it 10% of all Title I dollars, that may be a little bit high, but I know it's a lot. So they're going to get 10% of the available dollars for ESSER as a state. And then within Texas, let's say Austin gets 5% of the amount of Title I funding going into Texas. That means Austin would get 5% of the ESSER dollars. So these dollars flow on the basis of a Title I proportionate share. So not exactly on the Title I formulas, but whatever your proportionate share, when you look at all the other states and then all the other districts, that same share is what you get from these dollars. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with that, right, is that not all districts have enough poverty to even qualify to get Title I dollars. So they may not be receiving any federal dollars through the stimulus money. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that the more poverty a district has, the more dollars they're going to be receiving because their proportionate share is higher. If you're a district with a smaller percentage of poverty, your percentage of the stimulus is going to be the same as your Title I share, but it could be a lot less. So it's not the same amount everywhere at all times, really tied to that notion of how many Title I dollars as sort of a proxy for poverty or low income status. 90% of the money a state got had to flow down to the local level. The state could hang on to 10%, and we're going to talk about some specific set-asides that they have. So most of this money going down to districts, and we'll talk about the timing of these dollars in just a minute, and then 10% at the state level, which I believe most states have hung on to that 10%. So once the dollar has hit the state, hit the district, there are some specifics here that we have to keep in mind. And these are set aside for evidence-based programming or intervention. So at the SEA level, they have to set aside money for learning loss, summer learning, and after school. And then when the dollars hit the district level, they have to set aside at least, now all of these are minimums, I want to make this clear, at least 20% at the district level to address learning loss. And so that's a minimum amount. I think many places will spend, much greater amounts. And these are only the percentages that apply to the American Rescue Plan or, the ESSER 3 funds. This doesn't apply to the true prior versions of the ESSER fund. Now, when we talk about evidence-based, and this is a really important point, it refers to the definition of evidence-based in the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. And in that definition, there are 4 tiers of evidence. One is the most rigorous randomized control trial. Think of like the way they test out, new medicines. And then there's a couple of intermediate steps. And then the 4th level, or the bottom tier of evidence, is basically if you can point to research, general research that undergirds sort of your theory of action. And they actually even will take logic models, meaning, if given certain circumstances, you apply a given, input, outputs will you see and what outcomes will you get? So if you Google logic models, you'll see a lot of different examples out there. But the idea being is that, there has to be some theory around how this should play out. Now that 4th tier, that logic model, that evidence-based based on generalized research, can qualify an expenditure under the rules that they've set up for the ESSER 3 fund. But you have to at least go through that step and see, does a given intervention, doesn't a given expenditure for learning loss specifically, but also for summer learning and after school at the state level, have this basis in evidence? Important pieces to keep in mind going forward. So what can these dollars be used for beyond those criteria I just set out? As you all know, very flexible. This is essentially the same group of authorized activities that dates back to the CARES Act and ESSER 1. So everything that was allowed in the CARES Act, the CRRSA from December, any authorized activity under the Every Student Succeeds Act, IDEA, the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, Perkins Career Tech, and McKinney-Vento. And then there's some additional pieces. So for example, school renovation, infrastructure pieces around schools to make them safer, healthier, ready for in-person learning. Very flexible, with the caveat that we have to keep in mind that evidence base and those set-asides. Now, I titled this slide Wonky Details That Matter. Some of these are just wonky details, but a lot of them do matter. So remember how I told you about the Title I proportionate share? But when you average that out, when you look at how much money does the ESSER 3 or the ARPesser Fund bring to districts, on average, it's about $2,500 per pupil. So that's not bad. When you add it to the CRRSA and the CARES Act, you're closer to $4,000 per pupil from those 3 bills. Your average district is going to see roughly a 20% boost in funding just from ESSER 3, just from the American Rescue Plan. One thing to keep in mind here, though, and this is where it becomes really important, there's strong maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity provisions. And now you can see on the right-hand side, there's lots of text. You'll be able to read that later when you get the slides. So maintenance of effort, you all may be familiar with. It's the idea that you need to maintain your effort or your spending on education. And you can see there's some details about how that's calculated. But the simple answer is you need to maintain your funding levels as a condition of receiving these dollars. Now, maintenance of equity is a new concept in federal law, and it's actually somewhat still a work in progress. So the U.S. Department of Education has put out some guidance on this. The notion at a very high level is that if there are cuts within a state, high poverty, or another way to say it, low-income districts or districts serving a high percentage of low-income kids cannot see budget cuts that are disproportionately higher than their more well-off peers. And then the same concept is true at the district level when they look at schools. So to restate the concept, when you're looking at, budget cuts, high poverty schools can't be disproportionately cut than their lower income peers. And so this maintenance of equity idea, it ties back to these dollars, and not only the focus in terms of addressing learning loss, the equity there. We all know that, students with disabilities, English learners, low income students, students of color are going to be the ones disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. The law goes further and tries to put into place these guardrails to make sure that if there are budget cuts, that it's not disproportionately falling on high poverty districts, high poverty schools. Now, the U.S. Department of Education has added some wrinkles to this where they're trying to apply this maintenance of equity even in situations in which there's not cuts. So what they're starting to lean into is this notion of the resource equity that states have with districts and districts have with schools needs to be on a level playing field, which kind of takes the concept, I would argue, a little bit beyond where the legislation originally was. But this is something to watch because this is federal legislation getting into the business of how dollars are distributed within states and within districts. All right, I spent enough time on that. Let me pick up a little speed here and move on to our next slide. So to get these dollars, so when the American Rescue Plan was first passed, the U.S. Department of Education moved 2/3 of those dollars down to the states and then held 1/3 of those dollars, and the states needed to apply to receive those dollars. Now, I'm going to show you a map in a minute, which is actually a little out of date, but we'll talk about that. So I wanted to pull out some key phrases in the application that the states had to submit. So you can see here that it's students who have been most severely impacted. There's long-standing inequities with these students. So they want the thoughtful and timely use, but here's that phrase, lasting impact on our schools and to address these inequities. And then this last piece is really important as well. So what's the accountability for these dollars? How do we know all of this money is going to good use, making an impact? Well, the department is specifically asking for states, and then states are going to ask districts, how are you going to show the impact? How are you going to collect data? How are you going to report on this data? How are you going to show that your usage of these dollars is tied back to evidence-based interventions and other activities that had a real positive impact? So when we think about these dollars, that's really important to keep in mind. All right. So on this map, this is a slightly out of date. We'll update it. Okay, so the states in blue have submitted their plans. The states in green have been approved. And then the states in grayish, whitish there have not yet submitted their plans. Now, the amendment I want to make to this is that Wisconsin, Virginia, and Vermont now have their plans submitted. So Colorado and Florida are the last two states not to have submitted a plan. So you see the states are in different places. And when you get approved, that unlocks the last third of the American Rescue Plan dollars. But keep in mind that a lot of states haven't distributed their initial tranche, the 2/3. So this plan really winds up driving the entirety of a state's American Rescue Plan expenditures. So if you haven't looked at your state plan, there's a link here that you can follow once you get these slides, and you can read the state's priorities. Some states put in specific dollar amounts that they're going to allocate toward these priorities. But if you're in a particular state and you want to know how the state's thinking about these dollars, go to their plan, because those plans will drive the district plan. So districts have to give their states their plan and how they're going to use those dollars. And guess what? The district plan is going to need to be aligned to the state plan. So there's some details here, including the need that there has to be public input, meaningful consultation. So your state, and every state's going to be in a different place. Some states, the districts have already submitted plans. Those plans may already be approved. In other states, that might be in the middle of that process. And then, of course, if you're in Colorado and Florida, you haven't even started yet. Okay. What's been spent? So a couple of resources here. On the left-hand side, the U.S. Department of Education has a spending tracker. So you can see, according to the U.S. Department of Education, how much they've spent on the CARES, how much money of the CARES Act has been spent, is a better way to say that, how much of the CRRSA, the December bill, and then, the American Rescue Plan, you won't see much spending there, but I believe they have that up as well. The National Conference of State Legislatures, little bit different approach where they're actually listing out state priorities. So if you want to look at the NCSL resource, that gives you sort of a cheat sheet, if you will, on what state priorities are in terms of their stimulus funding. And then on the right, this is a graph from the Center on Reinventing Public Education. They've been tracking stimulus spending. They've been looking into how districts have been responding. This is maybe a little bit tiny type, but I really wanted to focus in on, these different spending categories. So that top one essentially is learning loss, right? Which is not a surprise. The second one is social and emotional learning. Again, not a surprise. Then you've got, these other activities that I think are really interesting. So expanding technology capabilities. So we want to expand on those, but we also need to know if they're working. And so as you go through these, you'll see there's a lot of different priorities, but these are really important to keep in mind. And so again, we'll share this deck and you can read this at your leisure, but special education students are specifically listed, parent and family and community engagement, supporting assessment and accountability systems. Remember, those are coming back online this year. So there's a lot going on, and these dollars, it really shows the flexibility, but also the need to understand how these dollars are being used. All right, I'm going to wrap it up with this. So that was our tour through federal stimulus funding. If you want an infographic, there's one that we can provide you. You can email me directly, and you can get these, easy to understand sort of specifics about the funding dollars, just to even remind yourself. You may kind of know it, but kind of a helpful resource. So these are also available, something that, we'll make available for you to download as well. All right. So I probably went on a little bit long here, but I want to pull into the conversation or bring in Carl. I want to bring in Harrison as well. And Carl, what are your thoughts? I just threw a lot of information out there, so help us make some sense of it.
Yeah, my head is swimming with all of that. That is an amazing amount of data and detail. And first of all, thank you for taking the time to kind of organize it in a way. I know we get a lot of acronyms, and so to hear, ESSER, but also ESSA, and then ESSER 3, and then Carpe Diem, or whatever the next one is. But the truth is, we need to seize the day. See what I did there? When it comes to these funds. And I love that you kind of laid it out that way too. So my question, I guess, let's dig a little deeper into this, because I'm coming to it from a tech director side. Now, some of the folks in the chat are coming to it from other angles. First of all, do you even have a seat at the table? That's a big thing. If you're someone in the chat right now, it's a leader. Do you have a seat at the table that's discussing the use of these funds? That's probably step one for most of the people watching. But for me, the first thing I drifted to, and I pulled it up here, it was on your notes, where you talk about the thoughtful and timely use of the funds having that lasting impact. Both my excitement and concern, I would say, is that we're going to run out and we're going to grab a bunch of stuff, a bunch of tools, a bunch of things that we think are going to help, and then we're going to just see what happens and see what sticks. And so it sounds to me like when it talks about the thoughtful and timely use, you're saying that's great that you can buy these things, and there's some flexibility, but make sure you're also keeping track of it. Is that right?
That's right, Carl. And it's, the U.S. Department of Education putting an emphasis on this. And so I don't mean to get political. This is small p political, but, there's a lot of visibility on these dollars, and there's, a historic amount of funding that's been provided now, albeit, on the heels of a pandemic, during a pandemic. So a lot of it absolutely very much needed. But when you talk about $200 billion going out over the last year, on top of, in a lot of places, state and district budgets are recovering faster than I think a lot of people thought. So maybe the early spending was backfill, but particularly as we look at the American Rescue Plan, these are starting to be dollars over and above, the existing budgets. And so the scrutiny on these dollars, particularly by Congress, but even by, state legislatures, one of the reasons Florida hasn't done anything with their plan yet is because they're like, you're getting so much from the feds, maybe we can cut back our own spending. And so the ability to show impact, to be able to tell the story of this is what we invested in, this is the data that shows it's making a difference, and here's why we did it, is incredibly important, because, we don't want the story to be written in 2 or 3 years, to your point, Carl, of like, yeah, we've got a lot of shiny toys and we have no idea if it made any difference with anybody.
Yeah, and I feel like you could track the easy parts of tracking would be like on the SEL side, you're hired X number of counselors, or you've added this many health, nurses for your schools, or maybe some sort of filtering equipment or something like that to help with that the safety part of it. But that wide flexibility, again, I get like sparkles in my eyes because as a tech person who would love to have had a bigger budget than I had, just to kind of meet some of the needs of those fringe learners or the learners that were probably, like you were talking about, those that don't have the equitable access. And now maybe I have the ability to do that, to reach their household or to reach with better network infrastructure. I think that's exciting to me. But again, nervous also because I'm like, okay, but I have to make sure I have some way of tracking all of this. And then
So
the
Carl,
other thing,
question for you, Doug, as you iterated throughout right there, right? A lot of these challenges that we had before the pandemic existed, right? The learning divide, digital equity with devices and access to internet and connectivity. Carl, from speaking with other directors out there, how much of these dollars have accelerated plans that already existed to combat these challenges? And how many of them do you think are just brand new now that they've got additional funding and more resources?
Yeah, from what I'm hearing, again, and this is talking to a tech director, CTOs from across the country, most of them, what they've spent their funds on were two areas. One was, of course, infrastructure upgrades, just internally. They did a Band-Aid with hotspots and school, hotspots on buses and things like that. But everyone knows that's a Band-Aid. That is not a long-term fix for at-home connectivity. But the other big area I would say is the influx of one-to-one, or something that has been happening for over a decade. But finally, I think schools found that they needed to have a device for every kid to be able to access all of these amazing tools and resources that they're paying for. And so I've seen that step up quite a bit, unfortunately, with the pipeline of how devices and technology is getting to us. Sometimes there's delays. I've heard it could be weeks, months. I've heard people are not getting their devices, even though they plan to get them by the beginning of the school year. So that put some things on hold. But I feel like that's kind of the next big thing that's coming in. And then after that, of course, the third thing, which I think is what they're leaning toward, is like, okay, now how do we make this sustainable? Because sure, it's a one time, or you've got that little window that I like you showed up there on the screen, Doug. But how do we make that a little bit more, longer lasting, and make sure that we can absorb it into budget so that in 2025, when the funds are gone, we're able to continue to do this and make an impact on learning. That's where I'm seeing the biggest concern out of the tech director world.
And if I could just jump on that real quick, it's a great point, Harrison, that it's not like what we were doing pre-pandemic was working for all students, right? And so those academic gaps, those inequities have really, every data point I've seen have only gotten worse, and through the course of the pandemic. And so how do you start to think about these dollars, particularly this last tranche of funding, to make sort of that transformational change? Because just going back to what you're doing before, I don't think is a strategy, frankly, that's going to be very successful. And so when you look at these dollars, I didn't say, but I want to point out that, again, wonky but important, supplement, not supplant, does not apply to these dollars. So you could start something using these dollars and actually transition over to doing something with state and local dollars. So that's a real flexibility with these dollars. And by the way, if you're not checking to see what was working before, just adding more into the mix isn't going to fix your problem. So as you figure out, with your new investments, there may be some old investments that you realize that wasn't doing me any good. Why am I still spending on that? I should be doing what I can tell is working based on how I'm tracking it right now. So I think there's also some opportunities to reset some of that spending and not just do, iterative budgeting, but actually maybe even consider some zero-based budgeting where you go back to ground zero and rebuild your budget in a different way than just, tweaking on the margins.
Yeah, like why continue to spend money on that old car that you had to put all the upkeep in when you could buy a newer one, or maybe just invest all your funds in making sure that the get a newer car that's lighter. I'm thinking in terms of my world, like maybe not so much on-prem servers or not so much upkeep stuff, like moving to cloud-based things a little more often. Maybe this was the motivation and the impetus to get it forward. And then knowing that I could use some of those services to help me actually track some of the data too. Let me just throw a question in real quick because I saw this came up in the chat. This is from Kristen, who is asking kind of, and this was getting a little bit into the weeds, but it's curious. I'm curious about this because I actually have a 504 student who does not get IDEA services. So, and she mentions, she's concerned because the learning loss for those students is also great, but is it not being addressed? Or Doug, is that kind of falling under all those 504 kids? Are they underneath the rest of the umbrella, not necessarily that 3 million that was for the IDEA?
Absolutely, Carl. So they'll fall under that broader umbrella. I know the 504 wasn't specifically called out, but absolutely. I mean, to the extent that you've got students who are impacted by the pandemic, remember, you do have to tie it back to that. It's not just, anything goes here. But, to the extent that they were impacted, they've fallen behind, there's lost instructional time, there's additional supports, the things that they need. Absolutely. Even though I know, that wasn't specifically listed, under that broader sort of rubric of we need to help these students and these students have been impacted, you have flexibility as a district to allocate funds. You may, know that they're 504 specific students, but I'm guessing you're going to be doing that across a wider swath of kids who've been impacted. So there's no prohibition against. You would just need to make the case of why you're spending on those particular kids, but you could do that with these dollars.
Yeah, and I noticed also there's a couple other questions kind of getting into the weeds on some of it, but I think the big thing I'm hearing, and I see Corey is talking about getting new positions and things like that, creating new positions maybe. It sounds to me, Doug, like what you're saying is like you have to have a plan. If you don't have a plan yet, that should be part one is let's design a plan of what we're going to do as the fund comes in. Of course, you also have to look at your state to figure out how much of those local dollars you're getting, look at your Title I to see how much you're getting. But then once you have that plan in motion, it sounds like you're also saying make sure you also have a way of tracking and reporting everything that you're doing. So don't just say we're going to do all this great stuff and then forget that important last part. So what are you hearing? Is there what are I mean, I remember what I did when I was a tech director. I went to all the websites and all the subscription services I had, and I would look at each one and go, okay, what's the login time looking like on here? How often is these classes using it? X, Y, and Z. It would take me weeks to go through all the data. But what are you hearing out there? Is that something that we should be thinking about? I mean, again, and Harrison, I think, has an idea here too, because I've seen some of what his platform can do. So I'd be curious to hear that as well. But I mean, Doug, are you seeing anything on your end on the national perspective too? Because I'm seeing some different stuff out there. But again, it's kind of catch as you can, as with anything else.
Yeah, I think, Carl, it's more of and that's one of the beauties of our education system, right? That there's not one approach, there's not one specific way, and there's a lot of local context. But this idea of we have to understand what we're spending money on. Is that aligned to our plan, right? That's even, I hate to say it, but kind of new ground for some folks to say, our budget, we have a plan, so our budget and our plan are aligned, and then we're collecting data to have a feedback loop to make sure that what we spent on is actually moving our plan forward. So I know that there's different ways, different approaches out there, everything from homegrown to, different, solutions that are done by professionals that you can purchase. But not doing that, I think not having a solution in place to collect the data, to be able to understand the impact, and then to be able to share that not only with your community, not only to make sure that we're advancing the education of students, but also to the broader, sort of policymaking community. Because again, and just to reiterate, the story we can't have told in 3 years is that was a colossal waste of money, that we just frittered it away and we have no idea what happened, and we can't really say that anything good happened. Like, that is almost like, kind of be careful what you wish for. I know we didn't wish for the pandemic, but we've got all of this funding and so many opportunities ahead of us. We really need to make sure that we're doing the things right now to be able to understand the positive impact these dollars made on the lives of students and families and teachers, when these dollars start to run out.
And Doug, I saw you had different categories listed there for, the expenditures of this. Is the federal, I know we're talking a lot about the SEAs and LEAs here, but at the federal level, it seems like they're keeping tabs on how that money's being spent, whether it's investing in technology or supporting ELL students. Are there plans there, of in 3-4 years to evaluate how each state and each LEA spent their funds?
I'm sure there will be. The immediate sort of categories are right around monitoring will be, did you spend at least 20% at the district level on learning loss? Did your spending tie back to the fact that this was driven by, a need arising out of the pandemic? At the state level, did you spend at least 1% on summer school or after school? So there will be some broad reporting categories as well as some detail around, okay, show us what you spent money on. How did that align to your plan? And how did that align to the broader needs and goals of these specific, areas? But then within that, I'm sure if it's not the federal government, there will be researchers, there will be other folks looking to see, how much was specifically spent on students with disabilities, how much was spent on English language learners. Can you show me the intervention, the evidence-based intervention that you put into place to help your low-income students, recover reading and math performance, just to pick an example. What did you spend it on? What were your results? All of that kind of reporting are going to be things that people will be very interested in being able to see, even if it's not required by the federal government.
I think there's an in-between part too that I think I skipped over even as I was going through that. So there's the whole plan, looking at your state agencies, creating a plan. There's the whole end part where you're gonna have to make sure you're also thinking about at the end, how are we gonna report all of this and track it? There's the middle part, and I think that what Nicholas is saying here in the chat is also interesting, is like, how do we correlate data of student achievement? You're talking learning analytics here, data about the teaching strategies they're using. So somewhere in between, I think that's an important part that maybe the people that are listening on this webinar need to think about too, is how are we impacting actual teaching and learning? Meaning, are you putting funds toward professional learning, professional growth of your teachers? Because I think it's one thing to say, I'm going to buy a bunch of credit recovery software, stick the kids on the machine and hope it works. But there's also that art and science of teaching that we need to make sure that we're putting in there. And I think the good thing about this, from what I'm seeing, Doug, I'm looking at all the websites you shared with me now. I'm looking at everything. There is some room in there for that professional development, that flexibility to give teachers better tools, better strategies to meet the needs of all learners. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a harder thing to track, I think, than tracking tools, so to speak. But I think it'd be something that's part of an evaluation system going forward. I'm not sure how that would work, but I agree with what Nicholas said in the chat. And I think that's something I want to make sure we mention, that that's going to be an important part when we look at the investments here in a second. And I know Harrison's going to show us a little bit about this too. How do we then take that data and make it actionable data? Like, is it something that we're just going to say, oh, that's interesting, we didn't use, blank tool very much. Well, what are we going to do with it? Are we going to get rid of it, or are we going to train more on it? Do we know it has an impact on learning? Therefore, we should train more and help make sure our teachers are more supported with it. And I think that's an important part of this too.
And Carl, both you and Doug kind of alluded to it, but why don't I jump in right now then and share with you a little bit about what we're doing at NetRef, because I think it's come up a couple of times now about tracking it. Doug, you mentioned, I just wrote it down, but checking old expenditures, having an evidence-based approach for how you're going to allocate and track these different funding. And at NetRef, we've done a couple of different things, particularly recently, and a lot of it was initially kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic and what districts needed at that time last summer. Over the past year, we've kind of shifted some of our reporting to help districts and schools meet some of these challenges and requirements that are tied to these dollars, but I think more importantly, tied to the outcomes, right? Because I think that's why we're all on this call here, and in education is to make sure that that we're moving the needle here. And I think to your point, Doug, earlier about we can't keep just dumping money at things that we were doing before the pandemic if it wasn't working, because that's not going to get us anywhere. We need to reevaluate things. So let me share my screen really quickly, and I'll just touch on this. I'll touch on a couple reports we've got, and then we can get back to a couple of these questions that have popped up, because I really like the discussion that's going on in the chat. This is a lot at once here with all the different student squares and tiles you see. I just wanted to mention this for those on the call, because I think at a very at a much lower level, at the teacher level, this is where NetRef can also impact learning. And then I wanted to jump over to the reports, but NetRef is two things primarily. One, it's a software program to help teachers keep students on task on those activities. So over the last year and a half, 10 years, we've been rolling out software to impact ELL students, credit recovery, math, reading. We've moved to a blended learning approach in most of our districts now. The important thing is keeping students on task and making sure that, hey, they are focused on Khan Academy or a math program or a reading program, so that they're not getting distracted on YouTube and Netflix. So that's one side of the house to NetRef, and we're looking at the teacher side so you can see what's going on, and then more importantly, focus attention on just those websites. But I did want to jump back into the main discussion that we have now about all of this funding, and even beyond ESSER, state and local funds as well. Now that we're investing so much into technology and software, how are we tracking it? How are we making sure that we're getting a good return on investment? And that's one of the reports that we try to provide to our partner districts at NetRef. And you can see on the left-hand side here of the screen, it's called ROI. So exactly that, return on investment report that we've established. And one thing that we did last year at the recommendation of one of our partners that's been working with us for quite some time is they said, hey, it'd be great if you could categorize websites, and then I could run reports on those. So we've created a tag called a paid tag where you can add all of your websites or software programs you pay for and then track them. You can see we're looking at East High School here, and we're looking at last week. So imagine you could create a tag for all of your ESSER funding as well. So any programs that you've used CARES money or ESSER funding on, you could create a tag called ESSER. And then you can track all those expenditures. Right now I'm looking at last week, but this could be over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years. And then you can dig into each program that you've spent money on. Now, NetRef is just going to be able to track those software programs, right? That's what we're talking about. Khan Academy. How many licenses have you purchased? What's your adoption rate? How much did you spend on it? Okay, if you spent this amount of money on it, what's your actual effective cost per user? So just kind of a system to track this. And then, of course, you can get into the weeds a little bit there. And let's say Khan Academy, you see we've got a 7% adoption rate. Doug mentioned, taking stock in where you are right now. What are your current outcomes? If we're at 7%, how do we move the needle and get that to 100% if we feel that Khan Academy is a really effective tool that's going to help our students with math or another subject? So you can take Khan Academy here and then pull up another one of our reports that, for the interest of time, I've already run. So we've got the site breakdown report here in NetRef with Khan Academy. I can dig in and look at by student or by teacher, which teachers are implementing or incorporating Khan Academy into their instruction the most, or which students are using it. So I can identify those students that, hey, yes, are power users, and those maybe toward the bottom that need intervention or some sort of assistance to make sure that they're actually working through the lesson plan at hand. And lastly, I'll just show you kind of taking a good overview of all the programs that you've got in your school or district. You can look at the top sites that your school is implementing. And here's where we want to get rid of Instagram and Khan Academy. Just like Carl, you mentioned old cars. I've got one that's about 15 years old that's making a lot of noises. Maybe you want to swap that out for something new. Same thing with a lot of these educational programs. If we're just not getting or seeing a good return there, maybe it's time to reevaluate. Kick it back to you, Carl and Doug, just to kind of go into the weeds a little bit more there.
Yeah, I like this question that Nicholas has asked. He's asked a couple of good questions in the chat there. The one about the ROI model, which is interesting, is there any adaptability to the stuff that you can do on NetRef side? I mean, can you add columns or add I guess could you add other different data points if you wanted to, like tag certain items in that ROI?
Yeah, that's a good point, Nicholas. So I think, any sections that we'd want to add from either a direct connection with the SIS or your LMS would probably be good data points. So if you're pulling it from Canvas or Schoology and seeing the actual score, so or state level scores, if you're doing that in your district, and you can see, hey, I want to tie Khan Academy to our standardized math test, right? That may be another data point that you want to look. I think the more we add into that report would obviously provide more insight into how Khan Academy, beyond usage, is actually impacting a learner's achievement.
And I think that's the tricky part is when you start talking about fidelity of statewide assessments versus are the kids
Yeah,
actually
as soon
learning?
as I said, I know I went down another rabbit hole.
No,
For
but
another
if you're
panel, right? But
yeah, but if you're creating a portfolio of what this kid is learning or what a student is learning, I mean, having these data points, I think is a great building block to create that portfolio. Like, are they actually showing growth? And then when you look at some of those assessments, hopefully there's some corollary tie-ins. And I think that's kind of what Nicholas is asking there too.
Well, and I think too, right? Like the other, particularly as we think about equity. So this is less about outcomes, right? But about, so if you can tell, on an aggregate level, who's using a particular resource, if it's a website, it's an app, can you start to also see, okay, which of the students are using it, if it's not 100% adoption, if it's something less than that? Because what I would guess you would find, particularly with lower income students who don't have as many, maybe out of school opportunities to access resources, right? Or, it could just be within a district, a school that has more low income students. Perhaps you're seeing less adoption there. So you can also see inequities of engagement and adoption, across a classroom, a school, a district, heck, even a state, as sort of a precursor to, getting to some of those outcome measures to say they've never used it. You can't figure out what the impact has been. So are we seeing trends within the data about who's actually using it? Because we all know, right? A lot of times, the higher income students who have high levels of sort of support and, they're going to be going after all this stuff. And you find out that like, hey, all of our kids who are, wildly proficient are using all of this stuff. And none of the kids who arguably may need it even more aren't. You've got a problem, but then you can go address it right before you get to that point where you've invested for 3 years and don't have results. And gee, wonder why.
Yeah, and Doug, to your point, if this is being assigned for homework, right, or outside of school work, and you see there's certain students that are on the lower spectrum of usage, well, that could be they don't have good connectivity at home. Right? Mm-hmm. They can't access it. And so that's something that could be addressed also with this funding, and hopefully is.
Which, and I didn't mention, partly for time and just so many things you can cover, but there was money in both the CRRSA, the American Rescue Plan, and actually there's more proposals on the table for more broadband connectivity. So if that's an issue, there are increasing number of resources coming from the federal level to connect students and families to broadband, to the type of connectivity that you would need. So just wanted to point that out. I didn't cover that there, but there's a lot of resources. Most of it's being run through the FCC. So if you just, do a basic Google search, you'll find, some good information out there about the various supports that are available beyond these dollars that are specific to broadband.
Yeah, then I see the challenge is going to be like, how do you identify those students that have high quality bandwidth or don't at home, right? And it's been done in the past. It's just a survey. Well, that's an internet survey usually. So if mom and dad don't have access to the internet, or I mean, it's going to be tricky. I think you're going to have some sort of at home. Like I know that NetRef, you guys have been trying something like that too with the at home bandwidth report. You rolled that out this summer, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, Carl. I was going to jump in. I didn't want to make this all.
No. I know. I think it's
about
a perfect
that. So
segue. Yeah,
we did, and I'll mention this too because districts or schools that are on the call. If you do want to capture your students' connectivity. We can do that at no cost for you for a limited time, but
Awesome.
we can do it at no cost. If you want to roll that out to your students, we embedded a speed test within our app, NetRef's app, so you can start gathering metrics as to the download and upload speed of your students. And then if there is a need there, you can issue hotspots like we talked about earlier, or to Doug's point, I know the FCC rolled out the summer emergency relief. It's temporary, but sounds like Doug's heard that there's more coming down the pipeline, which would be fantastic. So we can work with your teams on that if you are interested. I just noticed, I want to keep talking about everything, but I just noticed that it's 3:53
Oh, wow.
here. We're coming up toward the end. Yeah. So let me, why don't we open it up for questions? I know Nicholas and a few others have had some really good questions come through the chat, but why don't we stop there and open it up for others? Doug, Carl, just wanted to thank you both for joining and sharing that. And to echo what Carl said at the beginning there, Doug, that's the easiest, I think, federal funding, anything associated with government spending has been explained to me. So I really appreciate the big graphs. It made sense. So hopefully for everyone else that jumped on, it was helpful for you.
We love infographics.
As much as it was for me. So Emily, let me turn it back over to you, and any questions that we didn't see in the chat, maybe we could go through those right now.
Yeah. And I do just want to mention, Harrison touched on this, that you are eligible as a webinar attendee or as anyone, so you can share with colleagues, to use NetRef free for 30 days. And that includes that bandwidth report that will run automatically with your students, with their families, not having to do anything to find out what their at-home internet bandwidth speeds are. And that can help you with planning for homework, obviously those resources, as well as if there is another need for distance learning. And as part of that trial, you'll get access to all the other learning analytics reports that Harrison showed and the classroom management tools. So head on over to net-ref.com and check that out. We did get some questions, so we'll take a few until we run out of our time together. So Doug, this is probably starting with you, but the others can chime in. That this person understands that states and districts have to say that they're going to use tutoring, summer school, extended school days, etc., to help address learning loss. But we don't have teachers willing to take on anymore right at the moment. So what happens if those interventions aren't realistic for implementation and staffing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's both the opportunity and the challenge of the flexibility. So no one's saying. So the state set-asides, right, and it doesn't say exactly how the state needs to devote those dollars to after school. Perhaps, right, some states may take this role on. They may do some sort of vetting of providers of after-school services to sort of say, this is a list you could potentially choose from, district, right, of additional resources beyond what you may provide yourself that we've vetted. Here's the rubric. So there could be some activities in that sense. At the district level, no one's saying you have to do tutoring. It is among the list of interventions that you should probably consider. And I think there are, to an earlier question Nicholas was getting at, that there is more research now about what effective tutoring should look like than there ever has been before. So if you had sort of nightmares of No Child Left Behind tutoring, this is not it, right? Like, it's not required. I think we know a lot more about the kind of tutoring that really makes a high dosage tutoring is kind of the term of art. But if tutoring doesn't work because you don't have enough folks to do it, or you don't have good third-party providers that you can partner with, it doesn't mean you have to do tutoring. You can do stuff during the school day. And this sort of ties into a question David Harper had. You can look at technology solutions. You could do tutoring if you chose that's the route. If you wanted to do high dosage tutoring, but bring a technology provider in, an ed tech, someone tutoring at a distance, do it online. So I think there's some creative solutions out there. To David's question, these dollars are flexible. So if you're looking at ed tech, and if you're looking at ways to measure your ed tech investment, a la NetRef, absolutely these dollars can be used for that purpose. You just have to, again, make the connection, right? We want to understand, these expenditures as related to the pandemic, and we want to measure and really understand their impact, as long as you can tie it back to how these dollars were provided in terms of responding to the impact of the pandemic. Absolutely. It's very broad use, and you could definitely use these funds for that purpose.
Great. And Carl, this somewhat ties into that question. Just wondering what you've seen in your work in districts in terms of how districts are addressing shortages in teaching staff, and how they're potentially using funds to help rebuild and rejuvenate the people that are on hand.
Yeah, from the schools I've been working with, it's. I think this is a national thing, but I mean, I'm obviously mostly around Texas. But there is a definite shortage at the moment in terms of high quality teaching staff, where you'd have maybe 100 people applying for a position, you're getting 1 to 3 candidates now. I mean, it's tricky. So from what I've seen, the districts that are doing it well, what they're doing is there is a lot more shift to online asynchronous when it comes to professional learning for these staff members, when it comes to making sure that their time is most valuable. I mean, we've been doing this for over a decade, but generally staff and schools still feel like you have to be sitting physically in a room for 6 hours as a teacher to get something meaningful. The truth is you don't have to. And I think now we're starting to realize that. And so districts have said, okay, well, we have these great teachers, but they're already kind of on a time famine, so to speak. So how do we give them the resources they want? So they do a lot of online, they do a lot of asynchronous, and then saying, okay, now let's see if we can figure out ways to pair them with like their best teaching practices with the best learning tools. And that's kind of the magic sauce there, of making it all work. But again, it comes back to how well are you, actually investing and implementing these tools? Is there fidelity done with it? Are they being trained on it? I know many teachers that are like, yeah, we got all these great, I won't name the device, but let's say we got a bunch of these devices and they're sitting in closets because no one's come and told us how to use them. And that just breaks my heart. And I think some of it is just because there is a shortage of that. So using folks like Doug, myself, leaning on people that are out there in the field, we can help you kind of get in that right direction if you need it. But I think we had to make sure that we always remember that professional learning side of it.
And we'll sneak just one last question in. So Doug, are these state plans that then trickle down to district level and school level plans, are they set in stone, or is there the ability to modify these plans over time?
Absolutely. In fact, in the district plans, there's a built-in concept that you need to be revisiting these and constantly engaging with stakeholders and getting that meaningful consultation. I absolutely expect states to revisit these plans that they've put together over this summer or into the early fall. The Department of Ed hasn't been totally clear about what that process will be, but I think everyone recognizes, particularly, I know we're not through the pandemic, but as we sort of, move to a new stage of where we're at, that means there's going to have to be a shift in priorities, perhaps a shift in spending. So I expect these to evolve. Probably not tremendously. I think the priorities probably stay, pretty solid in terms of what they're trying to address, but the specific sort of tactics and ways they go about addressing those priorities may shift over the coming years.
So continuing to be flexible and adaptable as we have been for months now. So that's good. Well, I am sorry that that's all the time we have for questions. This has been a really great conversation, fun to listen to, and really informative. So thank you, Doug, Carl, and Harrison for being here with us. And just as a reminder, again, you can take advantage of NetRef's 30-day trial offer, and it's really simple to get started. You don't have to do much. Speaking of staffing issues and everybody having too much on their plate, NetRef makes it really easy to get up and running. So I encourage you to check out net-ref.com. We'll also send you some information in a follow-up email about how you can take advantage of that trial offer. And if you don't want to implement the whole thing during the trial, that's totally fine. You can just take a look at all those great learning analytics reports, the bandwidth report, and not even worry about the classroom management tools to start with, or vice versa. So again, flexible and adaptable is our motto. Again, it was wonderful to spend this time with you. We appreciate the opportunity to be here, and again, wish you a wonderful, successful, and healthy school year that lies ahead of us. So we hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Bye now.